Hello family, welcome to our channel. While the transatlantic trade is well documented, there are so many gaps associated with the Arab slave trade, despite almost a similar number of slaves having been shipped to the Arab world. Therefore, today we're diving into a hidden and often overlooked chapter of history. This dark period spanned over 1,000 years and impacted millions of lives. Join us as we uncover the shocking truth of the Arab slave trade, its origins, operations, and the lingering effects that continue to shape societies today. Before we start, please take a few seconds and subscribe to this channel for more of African insights. The Arab slave trade began in the 7th century, shortly after the rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. Unlike the transatlantic slave trade, which is more widely known, the Arab slave trade lasted from the 7th century well into the 20th century. It is estimated that between 10 and 18 million Africans were enslaved by Arab traders over the centuries. Slaves were taken from various regions, including sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Europe. The scope and longevity of this trade were vast, with significant social, economic and demographic consequences that have often been overshadowed by other historical narratives. In the 8th century, the Islamic caliphates expanded their territories across the Middle East, North Africa and parts of Europe. This expansion facilitated the growth of a slave trade network. Arab traders would capture or purchase slaves from different regions. These slaves were then transported across vast distances to serve in various capacities, from laborers to soldiers to concubines. The establishment of trade routes, such as the trans-Saharan route, allowed for the systematic and organized transportation of slaves. This route was particularly brutal. Slaves were transported across the harsh Sahara Desert to North Africa and the Middle East. Many perished during these treacherous journeys due to harsh conditions and brutal treatment. Prominent ports that were used in the Arab slave trade included Zanzibar, Kilwa and Mombasa on the East African coast. From these ports, slaves were shipped to various destinations in the Middle East, Persia, India and even China. For instance, the island of Zanzibar became a major hub for the Arab slave trade in the 18th and 19th centuries, with its bustling slave market seeing countless individuals sold and shipped off to various parts of the Middle East and Asia. Slaves in the Arab world faced harsh and varied conditions. In some cases, they were integrated into households and could gain certain rights. However, many endured brutal treatment and severe exploitation. The treatment and roles of slaves varied depending on their region of origin, gender and the needs of their owners. For instance, female slaves were often forced into concubinage or domestic work, while male slaves could be used as laborers, soldiers, or eunuchs in royal courts. One of the most notable slave revolts was the Zanj Rebellion, which took place between 869 and 883 AD in present-day Iraq. The Zanj, Bantu-speaking people from the Swahili coast of East Africa, were forced to work in salt mines and plantations under brutal conditions. The rebellion saw the Zanj slaves rise against their masters, establishing their rule for nearly 15 years before being suppressed by the Abbasid Caliphate. This rebellion is a testament to the resilience and resistance of the enslaved populations, despite the overwhelming odds they faced. The Arab slave trade had a profound impact on African societies. The constant raids and capture of individuals devastated communities, disrupted societies and led to a significant loss of population. Entire regions were depopulated, and the social fabric of many African societies was irreparably damaged. Slaves were taken from regions such as the Swahili coast, the Horn of Africa, and the interior of East and Central Africa. Notable areas of capture included present-day Tanzania, Kenya, Ethiopia, and Sudan. The legacy of the Arab slave trade is evident in the genetic and cultural landscape of the Middle East and North Africa today. The intermingling of populations over centuries has left a lasting mark, with descendants of African slaves present in many communities. For instance, the Afro-Iraqis, descendants of the Zanj slaves, continue to face discrimination and marginalization in modern Iraq. Despite their contributions to society, they struggle for recognition and equality. This ongoing discrimination highlights the enduring impact of the Arab slave trade and the need for continued efforts to address historical injustices. The decline of the Arab slave trade began in the 19th century, influenced by the abolitionist movements in Europe and pressure from Western powers. However, it wasn't until the early 20th century that the trade was effectively suppressed. The persistence of the trade into the 20th century underscores its deep-rooted nature in certain societies. For example, in 1970, Oman became one of the last Arab nations to abolish slavery officially. This late abolition highlights the entrenched nature of slavery in some regions and the challenges faced in eradicating it. One of the lesser-known aspects of the Arab slave trade is its scale and reach. Unlike the transatlantic slave routes, which primarily transported African slaves to the Americas, the Arab slave trade networks extended into Asia and parts of Europe. Slaves were taken from as far as the Caucasus, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. This broad scope meant that the Arab slave trade was not limited to African slaves, though they formed a significant portion of the enslaved population. The methods of enslavement varied. Many slaves were captured during military campaigns or raids. Others were taken as part of a tribute or tax system imposed on conquered peoples. Additionally, slave markets existed where individuals were bought and sold like commodities. These markets were often bustling centers of commerce, where the lives and futures of individuals were decided by their owners' whims. The treatment of slaves in the Arab world could be harsh, though it varied significantly. In some cases, slaves were integrated into households and could gain a measure of influence or freedom. For example, Mamluk slaves in Egypt, who were often of Turkic or Circassian origin, rose to prominent military and political positions, even establishing their own dynasties. However, this was the exception rather than the rule. Most slaves endured severe exploitation and brutality. One of the most tragic aspects of the Arab slave trade was the fate of the eunuchs. Many male slaves were castrated before being sold, a practice that was not only brutal but also dangerous, as many did not survive the operation. Those who did were often employed in royal courts or harems, where they were valued for their inability to procreate. The demand for eunuchs contributed to a horrific aspect of the slave trade, highlighting the extreme measures taken to control and exploit enslaved individuals. The cultural impact of the Arab slave trade is also significant. The presence of African slaves in the Middle East and North Africa influenced local cultures and traditions. African cultural practices, music and languages left an indelible mark on the regions where slaves were taken. Conversely, the cultural practices of the Arab world were introduced to African societies, creating a complex web of cultural exchange and influence. The abolition of the Arab slave trade was a gradual process, influenced by external pressures and internal changes. European colonial powers, particularly the British, played a significant role in pressuring Arab states to abolish slavery. Naval patrols and anti-slavery treaties were part of the broader efforts to end the trade. However, local resistance and the deeply entrenched nature of slavery in some regions made abolition a slow and challenging process. In modern times, the legacy of the Arab slave trade continues to be felt. In countries like Mauritania and Sudan, forms of modern slavery persist, with individuals being exploited in conditions reminiscent of historical slavery. Human trafficking remains a significant issue, with vulnerable populations being exploited for labor and sexual purposes. These modern forms of slavery are a stark reminder that the abolition of formal slavery did not end exploitation and human suffering. Understanding the full scope and impact of the Arab slave trade is essential for recognizing its influence on our world today. By shedding light on this hidden history, we can better appreciate the struggles and resilience of those affected. It also allows us to understand the complexities of historical and modern slavery and the importance of continued efforts to combat exploitation and promote human rights. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history. If you found this video informative, please like, share and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the untold stories of our past. Leave a comment below with your thoughts or any questions you have. Until next time, Stay curious and keep learning.